Last week on Legally Kidnapped.
Good evening. Our top story this week. In Florida, the child protective industry celebrates the one-year anniversary of the death of Nubia Barahona, which sparked the largest child abuse propaganda campaign the state has ever seen. Nubia was the 10-year-old twin who was found dead in the back of her adopted father's truck a year ago after being severely abused and tortured to death. Child advocates file a lawsuit on her and her brother's behalf, and the experts sit around debating as to whether or not the system is safer now than it was a year ago. Colorado has a new plan to reform their child welfare system by beefing up training for caseworkers, making data about child deaths more readily available, and employing a more common practice approach all across the state. In Kansas, legislatures amend the state's mandatory reporting laws in light of the Penn State sex abuse scandal. In Kentucky, a bill to open family court cases to the public advances. Kentucky legislatures are also backing a bill to require CPS agents to actually have social work degrees, and the state is ordered to pick up the pace in regards to the releasing of child abuse death records. In Washington, a state senator is criticizing the child protective industry over their failures in a case where the father blew up a house with his kids inside. In Ohio, the number of calls to the child abuse hotline soars over the last year, but the number of substantiated cases of child abuse and neglect remains the same. Oklahoma gets a surge in foster parent inquiries after a news story broke about babies being kept in overcrowded shelters. The New York legislature is suddenly concerned with a judge's decisions to place children with family members instead of in foster homes in child welfare proceedings. And the South Carolina legislature passes a bill banning some sex offenders from becoming foster parents. The U.S. Supreme Court refuses to hear a case where two Alabama grandparents wanted visitations with their teenage granddaughters. The state of Maryland will not renew contracts or licenses with the state's second largest foster care provider, saying that they failed to pay foster parents on time, amongst other things. In Nebraska, one of the state's largest foster care providers quits over money. And once again, the state will get to oversee most of their own child welfare cases. In Minnesota, an audit was done by sending 10 hypothetical scenarios to the different county CPS offices to see who would investigate and who wouldn't. And the audit discovers that there was no consistency among any of them, as in all cases some would and some wouldn't. Minnesota lawmakers debate putting a ban on the use of dangerous prone restraint in the state's schools. And in North Carolina, schools are targeting Latino kids in gang prevention programs by forcing them to falsely admit to such activity. In Virginia, a bill allowing private adoption agencies to deny placing kids with gays wins approval by the state Senate. The state of Indiana sold off a record number of foster kids last year. In New York, the son of Robert F. Kennedy is arrested after a scuffle with an aggressive nurse while trying to take his newborn out of a hospital. In South Dakota, CPS agents snatched the kids of the state's director of the American Civil Liberties Union. And in California, smokers are losing custody of their kids to their non-smoking exes. In India this week, the government is planning a state-level probe of abuse in the country's orphanages. India also warns Norway to give two kids back to their parents who were snatched by Norwegian CPS agents in a cultural dispute, saying that they were neither orphans nor stateless persons and enjoyed the full protection of the Indian government. Guatemala puts a halt to foreign adoptions, leaving many desperate to adopt Florida couples in the dust. Couples from China are coming to the USA to utilize surrogacy clinics because they are not allowed to use surrogates in their own country. Zimbabwe is cracking down on unregistered social workers. And in Russia, a foster mother beats the living shit out of a 6-year-old for taking a piece of candy. In Canada, experts are saying that the country's foster care system is in crisis, citing overcrowding, lack screening, and too few foster homes without consideration for the fact that they're taking too many kids. More and more children with gender identity disorder are taking hormones to block puberty and take on characteristics of the opposite sex. And a Quebec Human Rights Commission's investigation is raising serious concerns about foster children across the province. In Saskatchewan, the child protective industry apologizes to a real mother for failing to follow a judge's explicit orders to allow visits between her and her child. In Ontario, a member of Canada Court Watch is arrested at a protest against the Children's Aid Society, and nobody would tell anybody what he was being arrested for. And a father is arrested and his 3 kids handed over to the child protective industry after his daughter drew a picture of a man holding a gun on a piece of paper while she was at school, only to have the whole thing dropped a little while later when police discovered that the only gun in the house was a toy. In England this week, 2 social workers who lost their jobs over their roles in the Great Baby P failure appeal their sacking, and their former boss supports their efforts all the way. A British foster molester gets 21 years in jail for sexually assaulting little girls in his care. A child abuse victim victim wins a £10,000 payout after a social worker dismissed her as an attention seeker. British councils may be forced to allow mixed-race adoptions. Gay couples are being encouraged to become foster parents in Leeds. And a British mother is looking at jail time because her kids, one of which is in foster care, was caught talking to each other on Facebook. In entertainment news this week, Whitney Houston's daughter is caught getting high after the funeral. And Nicole Richie offers to loan her kids to Jessica Simpson to help her prepare for motherhood. A California lawyer gets 5 months in jail in an adoption scheme where surrogates were paid more than $100,000 to have babies who were then bought by adoptive parents. In Illinois, a foster molester is indicted and now seeking a reduced bond while he awaits trial. In New Jersey, a 16-year-old foster kid gets 30 years in jail for stabbing his foster father to death. In Minnesota, a foster mother is accused of neglect and child endangerment. And in Pennsylvania, a teenage girl is charged with assaulting a cop and a CPS agent because she didn't want to go to foster care. In Idaho this week, an Amber Alert is issued for 3 kids who were not returned to their foster home after a home visit with their mother. The FBI is called in and goes on the hunt for the kids and their mother, but the feds later confirmed that they had all made it to Mexico. In Massachusetts, a retired judge defends her decision to force a mentally ill woman to have an abortion and be sterilized against her wishes. The U.S. Marshals Service helps to get a child back to the USA after his parents fled to Mexico in an attempt to get away from CPS agents. The child protective industry in Georgia acknowledges its own wrongdoing in the death of a child. And finally, tonight in Michigan, the hunt is on for an 11-year-old girl who runs away from her foster home in an attempt to be reunited with her real mother. For these stories and all the latest dirt on the child protective industry, visit www.legallykidnapped.com. And until next week, this is Baby LK, over and out.